All right. Thank you for saving my life. Okay. We will not repeat what we what I just said. It's not central. But just to kind of say, okay, so there was only one problem with him trying to cure gay people, that he himself was gay. He frequently engaged in sex with men, and he was himself like an active, he had an active kind of sex life, a gay sex life. So it was a little bit weird that he tried to cure other people from being gay while being himself gay, or at least while engaging in romantic relationships with other men. So he was confronted by that, and now I think this is where it becomes a little bit more interesting. What he said is like, I am not gay. I have these impulses, but I fight them. I don't want to be gay, but I can't help it. And once in a while, I'm not proud of it. I give into it. But at the heart, my true self, what I really am, is I'm not gay, and I'm trying to rid myself of these impulses. And I think a lot of people found that very confusing, and some not. And the interesting thing is like, okay, if you think about what Mark's true self is he gay, is he not gay, is he truly gay or is he not gay, then the answer that you might give reveals us very much about how you think about being gay, but it also helps us to understand what people think the ideal self is. And we come later back and I tell you a little bit about how this inspired some research in social psychology looking at what people judge the true self to be. The other thing which I think is kind of like, which I just like recently discovered, last week I released the marks for our third year elective. There are about 100 students elected to kind of take this seminar, and then I offer to get feedback. You can give feedback here, you can get feedback on your coursework. You will be able to do that too. You can join me in person or online, and we chat about your feedback. And I think the interesting question that we want to kind of focus on today here is like, okay, whom would you predict would come to these office hours? Is it those students who did not do very well, who really need the feedback in order to improve the next time? Or is it those students who did already very well, who, yes, who basically have 70 and higher? Are these the most likely to join my feedback, my feedback hours? And just to kind of take it a little bit, or like reveal it a little bit, like what I mostly encounter in my office hours is students that try to seek or that seek feedback with me are those students that did very well on their coursework, and not those students who did relatively poorly, who would most benefit from the feedback. Why is that? And I will tell you the reason today too. I also want to kind of, and this will be in the recorded videos, but we will touch on that. We want to think a little bit about how social psychology thinks about mental health, okay? This might sound weird to you. It's like, oh, social psychology, it's not a clinical psychology. Oh, we are not clinical psychologists. Oh, not at all. But clinical psychology is an applied psychology, right? It takes the insights from social psychology and other fields and tries to use them to explain mental health issues and concerns. And cognitive psychology always assumes, okay, if a person is somehow mentally ill or has mental health problems, the problem is that they somehow misperceive the world, they misperceive themselves, they misperceive the future. For instance, they have an overly negative view of themselves, the world, and the future. And social psychology has a very different view. In social psychology, we think that people who are healthy, who are happy, people like you and me, are those that misperceive the world. And what a person that is, for instance, depressed is, they lack the ability to see the world in a biased view. And this will be in one of the additional videos where I'll talk about this in more detail. But this is part of the insights that we will have at the end of this session today, kind of trying to explain these somewhat puzzling behaviors people have, or these puzzling results we find in when we do clinical, or when we look at people, what separates people from that have mental health issues from those that do not. And we would talk all about this by talking about the self. Here's one quote, I think I have it also on Moodle, and it says, if you open the handbook of social psychology and flip to the index, you will find that there are more than 60 separate entries listed under self. And that's not including the sub-entries. This is more than any other word in the index aside from social, as in social psychology. The nature of the self is at the heart of psychology, driving many of its urgent and profound questions. I think for me, this made the planning for the session really frustrating, because I felt like, oh my God, there's so much interesting, profound, important stuff that I cannot teach you today. I think I have two somewhat longer videos that I will upload. One is already recorded, the other one I will upload, and then you can watch them tomorrow. But I feel like, oh, there's so much I wish I could tell you about it, because anything you want to understand, I think, at least in social psychology, the self, the processes of the self are at the heart of it. And that's why we start with it. And this is why we are kind of like on our journey to understand better social psychology. We're trying to understand, okay, how is the self organized? What's the content? What's the structure? What are the motivations behind the self? Here's a little bit like, I want to kind of give you the upshot of today's lecture. I want to reveal what it's all about, right? And one idea that social psychology has is that basically you and I, what we are, we're kind of like the most important actor in our own movies. The self is something really important. We see ourselves somewhat as stars or celebrities that act in a movie, okay? And so one thing is basically what you can see, there's a kind of fraud or tension. There's tension between us and the audience, the people that observe us, the people that also give us roles, what we should do. And I'll come back and explain that a little bit later. But this is basically an interaction. There's us, the self, who we want to think of ourselves as really like the stars of the show. And there's the audience. The audience has the power to take that away, but also assign us roles and things we should do. So we are a little bit like basically when we express ourselves, when we try to understand ourselves, we're almost like actors on a stage, and thereby we fill our content of the self. But there's one really interesting thing, is because one thing that's really important is that, or what social psychology suggests, is that this our perception of ourselves is protected by certain mechanisms, so that we do not see ourselves as we are. So the feedback from the audience and the feedback from the world is filtered through certain protective mechanisms that protect us from perceiving the way ourselves the way the audience or the world reflects us. And so this has the advantage that we feel good about ourselves, but has the disadvantage that we often lack kind of the insight into who we are and what are we good at and what are we not good at. So we are feeling good about ourselves because we don't really understand ourselves very well. So this is in the next kind of 50 minutes. This is what I'm trying to convince you is happening when we talk about the self. Okay, this kind of complex interplay where we we want to think of ourselves as good, but then ourselves as threatened, and then protective mechanisms protect us from perceiving ourselves as bad, but that comes at the cost of real self-knowledge. This is basically where we are. This is the three kind of chapters we do today. What is the self? We talk a little bit about self structure, content, and evaluation. Then we talk about self and identity. Very shortly, just to kind of mention it, we will talk about it longer in upcoming sessions. And then we talk basically about the most important bit today, self-enhancement, protecting the self. And then there are two videos about culture and self-presentation. One of my favorite videos I did last year, it entails two really like absolutely lovely one theory, my favorite theory about the self-completion theory. It contains about what happens if you fake to be something that you're not. How does that impact yourself? And it also talks about culture. We will come back to culture in the upcoming weeks again, but it already kind of gives you an idea why culture might be really important and why some of the insights we have about the self are really dependent on the being in the West and not so much in other more collectivist countries. And then we talk in a second video, talk about self-enhancement processes. I talk about the idea of these unconscious automatic processes and how they relate to depression. And both of these videos will be, one is already about 20 minutes and the other one will be of a similar length. Okay, so then we will have kind of like an answer also to how these insights relate to mental health and understanding what is going on when we are, for instance, depressed. Just one quick on the seminars. I just want to say I got some question about that. I think what we're trying to do in the seminars, and thank you so much for, yes, somebody asked me, oh, sorry, it's like somebody asked me if the PowerPoint is on Moodle. I think the PowerPoint is on Moodle. I hope so. If not, then I apologize. I can't really change that during the lecture, but I'm pretty sure I uploaded it. Quick word on the seminars. Thank you so much. I think all of you participated, all groups gave themselves a group name. Some were more daring than others. I will on Wednesday. You have till Wednesday, till 3 p.m. The chance to send me your paragraphs. I think 1 or 2 groups did not send me their paragraph yet. So the idea here is behind this award, right, is that you do something, you engage in the activities of each week, and thereby you gain points by and maybe a little bit motivation and fun. It's also, I think, the Social Rising star is like a certificate you will get, and I think it will really look good on your CV. This is something you did on top that you didn't have to do for credits, and this is also something that always looks really nice on your LinkedIn profile when I endorse this certificate, and also on your CV. And you should be proud of yourself, because if you win this group challenge, then at the end you kind of beat about, I don't know, 200 plus other students in their groups, right? So I think it's really a cool thing to do. I hope you share that. We will on Wednesday after 3 p.m. I will read the paragraphs, publish the points, and then we have our first leaderboard, and we can look who's leading it. And each week we will do something similar. This week we will start focusing a little bit on the feedback, on the coursework, and we will look at last year. They had one of the coursework questions was about the content of this year. Now I want to use that to kind of look at some of the answers students last year gave, and some of the problems and some of the strong bits of these paragraphs, and you will kind of try to analyze these paragraphs as part of your group work. Next week we will actually look at complete full answers to the question that related to next week's lecture. So we will look at the content, but we will look at through the prism of the coursework, and you will see and can mark last year's answers to kind of get a feel for how does the marking work, what are the criteria, and then you can see and compare how my marking compares to your marking or to your group marking, and thereby you should have a really strong idea about what is expected of you, what is good and what is not so good when answering this coursework. Okay, so let's talk content now that we have a little bit the like administrative things aside. I see some question. If you have any questions concerning missing content, etc., please just stay after this lecture. I have my office hour thereafter. I can't answer this during this lecture. I'm sorry, but I'm thereafter available. Okay. Let's talk about chapter 1, the self, structure and content. Okay, let's start with architecture. I have here in the subtitle, and we're just trying to understand, okay, if we think as psychologists about the self, what do we think about? It sounds so abstract, and it starts kind of abstract too. So this is a little bit like, what's the content of the actor and the scripts this actor has to act out? So one of the kind of more abstract things is what we call the self-schemata, right? So if you look at the Wikipedia definition of self-schemata or schemata in general, then it's something that is as an abstract idea or general notion that occurs in the mind. Well, so it occurs, obviously the self-schemata occurs in the mind as well. And they play an important role in all aspects of cognition. We will talk about schemata again when we talk about person perception, but here for now, it's just important to know that a self-schema is not just something like, oh, I'm Andreas, I'm a lecturer, and I like being a lecturer or something like that. No, it is filled with many, many details about what it means to be a lecturer, how to behave as a lecturer, how to dress as a lecturer, how you should respond, for instance, to your questions in the chat, and so forth. forth. So self-schemata and the roles we fill them out are very detailed. We come back to that, but this is for now just kind of to know that the things I kind of touch upon are often very detailed scripts, okay? The other thing is that in psychology in general and social psychology in particular, we assume that everything that is related to the self-schemata has a special status. It is more accessible, so you can either, it's much more easy for you to assess content, for instance, about yourself than about other people or things that are not related to yourself, right? So if I'm trying to convince you to, or trying to enhance your memory for these lectures, I have to try to connect the content here to your self-knowledge, to your self-interest, because that means it's much more accessible. It's also emotionally charged. So you can think about a schemata about something, a mental concept. For instance, you're trying to understand what philosophy is. Philosophy, you have some ideas, you might know some names, you might know some topics in there, but it probably most likely is not very charged emotionally. But everything that's connected to yourself is emotionally charged. It is not just you as a father, you as a student, you as a student in social psychology. No, all of these have like, ugh, don't like it, it's boring. Ooh, this is interesting. There is emotional. And this is what we come in our last point to, it is protected. The self-schemata has certain protections, and it's really hard to change your self-schemata, and it's not easily done. Here's two studies by Martin Conway. If you ask people, and this is about the memory, right? If you ask people, and here you can see, let me just push this here up. If you, Uppsala, oh, I can't, whatever. If you ask people, when they're like not at the end of their life, but if they're 50, to kind of remember things about their life, what you can see is basically, first you see what's called the childhood amnesia. Most people when they're 50 remember barely anything about their childhood, okay? But then you see what's called the reminiscent bump. You see this one aspect where people somehow between 15 and 20, they have almost as much memories about that than about their last year. Okay, so you can, I mean, there's clearly a difference, but there's this period in life that is really important. Somehow this is accessible in our memory. This is there, other things are forgotten. So now if you look at what do they remember about these years? What's the content of these memories? What you can see is basically, this is here again, kind of the 10 to 19 here on the y-axis. What you can see, maybe I can get a, oh, I can't get a, what you can see here on the 10 to 19 on the y-axis, right, is the black bar is going up. So what do people remember in this time is everything that's related to their identity. So if you look back and kind of what do you remember about your life, what you remember is those moments that formed your identity, that informed you who you are and what your music taste is, what your taste is in what, like what you want to study and so forth. So these are what we call the formative years, right? They're all about identity. So here you can see in action basically the idea that the self-concept and everything that's related to self and identity has a special status, right? Our memory makes sure that we can remember and draw on these memories in particular and easily that are related to who we are and what we like and what we don't like and what makes us special and unique. So this is just kind of like an idea. So if we think about, right, I had this last week already, where I talk a little bit, okay, like what, if you just like on a really basic level, if you're just like, okay, who are you, Andreas? What is your self-concept, right? Then you can say like, okay, I'm a scientist, I said it last time, I'm a teacher, I'm a father, I'm a husband, right? You have this like 4 different roles. Each of these roles is filled with different attitudes, with specifics and so forth. Okay. You can also see there's almost like 2 contexts. We know from research that different aspects of ourselves get activated in different positions. Right now, very much that Andreas as a teacher is activated. This is what guiding my thinking and the way I talk and the way I behave, and whether I use, for instance, curse words or not, or the type of jokes I'm allowed to make and so forth, right? So it's like a tightly scripted kind of manual for or how to behave, but also how I feel about myself with that aspect. I might do very poorly today. You might all be bored. I get negative feedback. I might feel bad about myself. And then I pick up my son, and then I'm in a different context. And now, for instance, Andreas as a father is activated, and I might feel better about myself again. So there are different aspects we have about their self. And sometimes, as you can see here, they overlap, and sometimes they do not overlap. So one thing social psychologists and clinical psychologists as well became very early interested in is studying the complexity of the self. This is here done by Linville, and she was really interested in thinking like, okay, how can people, like the self complexity, how does that protect people from stress and mental health concerns, right? And so what she thought is like the more or the less, this is better to say, the more complex the self is, the less the aspects overlap. So here you can see, I tried to kind of illustrate that, is you can see that all these scientist, husband, father, teacher do not overlap. They don't share much, which is a little, it's just artificial. I think especially teacher and scientist should overlap more, but I think there are certain things that I feel like all of these four roles have in common. Okay, but you can see then here's something that's very much like the opposite. For instance, if I would not be a father, not be a husband, not be, wouldn't have to teach, then I might just be the scientist, right? I might just work at my research lab and do nothing else. And the problematic aspect, according to Linville, is if we have very little self-complexity, then if something threatens that role, if something goes wrong in this area, basically we break down because other aspects of self can't buffer the threat that is given to one of these aspects, okay? So here I'm very vulnerable. I basically put all my eggs in one basket, and if that basket breaks, then I might break too. That's the idea of Linville. A little bit more subtle and more sophisticated would be to see how much overlap one has in one's self-concept. So complexity, self-complexity would also mean something like, okay, so if you compare the one in the left corner has more complexity than in the one in the right corner, what I try to illustrate here is maybe there are certain traits. For instance, being compassionate or being intelligent that I need in all of these roles, or perceive that all make me a good father, a good husband, a good scientist, and a good teacher. So if that is threatened, for instance, if I have the feeling that I am not as intelligent as I want to be, then all of these roles might be threatened, and the overlap kind of spreads the stress and leads to more concerns. So she thought very much what we need is we need separate roles, and often what then therapy would have needs to do is to install different types of self-concepts that can buffer against the stress. Here's one study where they find this is basically kind of like, okay, self-complexity as a potential cognitive buffer among abused women. So it's basically like, okay, if I'm an abused woman and I only have this one, for instance, concept of myself as being the wife of this abusive husband, and that is all I have, that really doesn't help me to cope very well with the situation, but I have a more complex self-concept, then I can easily escape, or more easily escape, the stress and the situation itself. So there's some real application to that. The other thing which is kind of interesting comes from research on guilt. So we're back at basically, imagine, it's not quite on a deathbed, but imagine that we would ask people on their deathbeds what they regret about their lives, okay? So this is a description by David Angelovich where they did this. I think they asked people who were about 60 to 70 what they regret about their lives, or maybe even a little bit older. I can't quite remember. And so they said in their lives, people have experienced various regrets. Sometimes people regret not being the person they think they could have been. They regret not achieving the goals they had set out for themselves and not fulfilling their dreams and aspirations. Other times, people regret not being the person they think they should have been. They regret not meeting the norms and rules they had for themselves and not fulfilling their obligations. Take a moment to think about what you regret most in your life. When you think about your biggest life regrets, what do you tend to regret more? So there are these two different ideas. There's one, it's like, what do you regret? You didn't live up to some kind of ideal that you set for yourself, or you didn't live up to the kind of ideals the other people around you set for yourself. What do you regret more in your life when you're looking back? And this research question is framed like that because it was inspired by Tori Higgins' idea of the ideal self, the odd self, and the actual self. So here, instead of kind of looking at, okay, complexity, here's like, okay, it's not just who we are and think we are, but what is also really important for us is who we think we could be, we should be, right? So the ideal self, it kind of gives itself a little bit away in the name, is something I want to be. Okay, so you might think like, oh, I really want to be, I don't know, a YouTuber. And then the odd self is like what people think you should do. Oh, you should become a clinical psychologist. You just studied psychology, so now you should go out and make a lot of money. Why are you not becoming a clinical psychologist, right? So, and let's say you look back at your life, what would you regret more? That you didn't do what other people thought you should do, or you didn't do what you really wanted to do. So would you regret more not becoming a YouTuber or not becoming a clinical psychologist? So this is like the question they're setting out to themselves. One thing that's really interesting about the Higgins is that basically, if you know what people have as ideal self and odd self, you can also explain their emotions. So what Tori Higgins suggested is that basically the closer the ideal self and the actual self come, the more you experience happiness. So a person that experiences happiness is a person that has a stronger overlap between their ideal self and the actual self. Right? So if I want to understand why somebody is happy or not happy, I have to look at what they want to be, what their ideal selves are. Okay. And then what happens if you achieve a stronger overlap about the actual self and the odd self? Well, what you see here is that then people feel relieved. Okay. It's like, oh, okay, I'm meeting the expectations of the people around me. That makes me calm, content, relieved. Okay. Basically the kind of absence of any type of anxiety. And then he said, well, what happens when the opposite is, when there's a discrepancy between the ideal self and the actual self? So what people then experience is, on the one hand, despair, sadness. And so if I have basically a large discrepancy between what I want to be and what I am. I really want to be a great father and I'm a terrible father. If I feel like that, if I perceive that discrepancy, then I'm depressed, right? If I kind of have a large discrepancy between my actual self and my odd self, then I feel anxious. Okay. So if you kind of try to understand why a person perceives anxiety or is depressed, then it would be good. So the idea of Tori Higgins and other people who followed this tradition of the odd self and the ideal self, you have to look into what type of ideal self a person had. It's not so much the situation itself. It's not so much whether they achieve something or not. No, it is the way their self-concept is structured. This is just to kind of reveal, if you look at the research by Davide Angelovic, the one that I kind of read out, the question, what do you regret more? It's very easy to see here on the y-axis, the actual ideal discrepancy. So what people, about 70% or 70 people, I think it was like a study of about 110 or so, or maybe even less, good old days. Well, it's not that old, that study actually. Is that most of the people felt really what they regretted in their life when they're looking back is not trying to achieve what they wanted to, and very few regretted or saying that they regretted most something that they should have done but didn't do. Okay. So I think if sometimes in my role as with employability, if people ask me, I really wanted to do that, but I think it's unrealistic or something like that, I always refer to these findings that like you should just try to do and figure out if you can achieve your ideal self. You should at least give it a shot, because not trying will lead to lifelong regret and yes, sadness. So this is the insight from that research that kind of tells us, okay, we really have to figure out what people want in their life, but we also, in order to explain then what they think they should do. And this helps us to explain their emotional life and their motivations. This chimes very well. Bronnie Ware, I think she's a hospice nurse. She wrote this book about what people most commonly regret. And this kind of fits very well into the research by Gilovich and colleagues. And he said, like, when people realize that their life is almost over and look back clearly on it, it is easy to see how many dreams have gone unfulfilled. Most people do not honor even half of their dreams and had to die knowing that it was due to choices they made or not made. Okay. So there's the power kind of like that these ideas we have about ourselves, who we want to be, have on our lives. So you can think about it like, if you think about these aspects, right? It's like, okay, the teacher, if I just think about the teacher, there's also the way I perceive my performance, the way I will feel about this lecture, about the seminars, about anything is also really impacted by the way I think I should be and the way I think I ought to be. Right. And between these, this will kind of produce a mix of emotions. So it's not just that we have certain roles, but also the things we perceive the ideal and the ought would be. Another really powerful concept is that when we think about the self concept, we should not only think about basically past and present, but often the most important aspect, and we kind of hinted at it already, is the future. So how do we think about ourselves in the future? Often when we make decisions, whether to pursue one career or the other career, we make decisions based on the people we want to become, right? We think like, oh, if I only choose this role or that role, then I will be this person or that person. So we have these ideas about who we want to do, want to be. Hazel Marcus, who wrote one of the most cited one most impactful articles ever written in psychology, and the article is in one of the uploaded videos about culture and the self. She has this idea that what drives really our emotional life is these ideas about possible selves we have, who we could be in the future. And we think there's a chance that I could be this or I could be that. And if you lack any possible selves, if you don't have any ideas about what you could be in the future, then you see very apathetic, unmotivated students or pupils or people in their lives. So if they do not entertain just by the existence of any kind of possible self, that really drags and drains often our motivation. A lot of kind of research or a lot of intervention built on that and trying to say, okay, what we need to do is inspire people to build up future selves so that they can find a motivation, something that drags them forward. She separates two types of possible self: the hope for self and the feared self. The hope for self is a little bit like an ideal self. We talked about this. This is something that's like, I would like to become a clinical psychologist. Okay. And I think it's a possibility that I can become a clinical psychologist. So this would be a hope for self. If you have that or you do not have it, you can immediately or have an intuition about how this will impact listening, for instance, a lecture that has some relevance about clinical psychology. If you have that hope for self, you're much more interested than not. And it has nothing so much to do with the content in itself that's provided or the way it is presented, but rather whether you have this idea or not. The feared self is something that basically, as says, that you think it's possible that you would become it. Maybe you think, oh my God, there's a real possibility that if I graduate with a degree in psychology, that I will not find a job and end up working at Primark or something. Okay. And if the more you think that is like a feared self for you, the differently you will react to the same events. You might, for instance, if something goes wrong, this kind of like, if you get a coursework back, the coursework is not exactly as you hoped for, this kind of reinforces this idea, and you will maybe really experience a sense of doom, while the person who doesn't have this feared self yet has the same mark will react very differently. So the future self is a very important part of our self concepts and is an expression, kind of like a self narrative about the future of what we want to become and what we fear we could become. And if we want to understand people, then we need to take the serious how they think about the future. Okay. One last thing. So they're like, we have kind of like now talked about the structure of the self, what is in it, these schematas. We talked about self complexity. We talked about aspects of past, future, and present self. We talked about how the art and the ideal impacts that. If you look at that, then another aspect, which is like super popular, actually was super popular in social psychology, but was kind of a letdown, which we come when we talk about attitudes, is self-esteem. So what is self-esteem? One of the most misunderstood concepts within psychology, especially students have a really hard time understanding what self-esteem is and whether it is important or not. When we think about self-esteem in the most basic way, then we think about basically an overall evaluation of the self. If I look at all the aspects, if I'm asked to kind of look at all the aspects of myself, how do I feel about it? This is the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, the most used self-esteem scale to today. The second most is I have high self-esteem, the one item self-esteem scale, which basically measures the same and correlates really highly with this 10 item. I only put 6 items here, Rosenberg self-esteem scale. And so it's like, on the whole, I'm very satisfied with myself. At times I think I'm no good at all. I feel that I have a number of good qualities. I'm able to do things as well as most other people. It's interesting, it has some things we come back to, the comparison to other people, to trying to figure out whether you're good or not. So the idea of the self-esteem is basically, it's an attitude, an evaluation of yourself, of all aspects. If you look at all of these things, right, then you're like, okay, overall, do you think positively about yourself? About 80 to 90% have a positive opinion about themselves, and that's good, as you will see later on. I think the biggest misunderstanding is what self-esteem actually measures and whether changing self-esteem does any good or bad. And we will talk about this in the attitude lecture, in our first attitude lecture, and kind of show that self-esteem in itself is not really something we should worry too much about. And most research in social psychology kind of abandoned this concept and doesn't really talk about this anymore. But we will come to this when we talk about attitudes. So how do I figure out, like, let's say I want to know whether I'm a good teacher, okay? How do I figure out whether I'm a good teacher or not, right? And the key answer that obviously social psychology offers is social comparison. And social comparison is like a very simple idea, but it's basically, let's say you have these, look at the picture on the left, you have like these two cars. If you only see this car on the left, you might think like, oh, it looks kind of okay. It's not the greatest car, but it's all right. But then the moment this other like new shiny car, the better version of it, stands next to it, immediately you feel worse about this car. Right? So it's like the comparison. We need something to make sense of ourselves. We need to compare ourselves to others, right? I could, for instance, say, okay, how many students come to my lectures? Then I could ask somebody else, how many students come to your lectures? I could see how your evaluations are. How are my evaluations? I could talk to students just to say, oh, what do you think about this lecture? How do you think about this lecture? I need to kind of some kind of competition and comparison, right? Often people think like, say like, okay, social comparison is the thief of joy, which is not 100% true, but a lot of people, a lot of us use social comparisons to put ourselves down, and I will explain in a second why that is. But one of the key ideas is, in order to figure out who am I and am I good at it? Am I intelligent? Am I athletic? Am I et cetera, et cetera? You need to compare yourself to others. So it's almost an inevitable bit of who we are as hyper-social animals, as uber-social animals. We need to figure out who we are in the hierarchy, and we can only do this by comparing ourselves to others. Here's a famous study on Olympic medal winners that kind of illustrates a little bit this idea of social comparison and gives us these two different types, upward and downward comparisons. So here you see a person that won the gold medal. She's in the middle, and here on the left is she won the bronze medal, and on the right she won the silver medal. Okay. And what they did is here, what they find basically is that they give people the pictures, these pictures taken at these Olympic ceremonies, and said like, okay, please evaluate how happy this person looks. So they would give her we would see her face, we would see her face, and we would see her face, and we would do this for hundreds of Olympic medal winner, and then just rate how happy they are. And what they find is that obviously the gold medal winner is the happiest, but then the bronze medalist appear to be happier than the silver medalist. Okay. And why is this the case? So the idea is that basically what the bronze medalist does is she does a downward comparison. So she's like, oh my God, I was so close to being fourth in winning nothing. Okay. And I'm so happy to be third. Okay, so her is trying to get in. She was competing with the fourth, and so she came in third. So her comparison is downwards to somebody who performed less good than she did. But the silver medalist, and so the idea, they do an upward comparison. They compare themselves with somebody better. Most of our lives, and I think athletes are especially prone to that, we do upward comparisons in order to motivate ourselves to do better, but it dampens our enjoyment of ourselves and our esteem, right? She's not, at least in this picture, she doesn't look very happy, even though she won a silver medal at the Olympics, which is an amazing achievement, but all she thinks is like, damn it, it was not gold. Right? And that's an upward comparison. A lot of when people talk about, for instance, the bad influence of Instagram on the way we perceive our bodies or our life is that Instagram basically is a constant upward comparison because everybody seems to live a better life on social media than we do. So we have constantly faced with upwards comparisons. But people often use downward comparisons, and we come back to that, to make them feel good about themselves. Okay. Self and identity. Okay, I will skip this chapter just because I want to talk. This is just a very short chapter, and we will come back to this when we talk about groups and self and identity group. This is just a reminder that part of our self concept is being a member of the group, and it's a really important one. So, for instance, here, this is a study. I will talk about this again. By Citron and all, they find that people say, like, what's the most important thing about yourself? About 60% of Americans said being American. So there is something, group membership is a real important bit of who we are. And we come back to this when we talk about group membership in, I'm not sure, week 6, 7, or maybe no, it's week 9. Okay, we come back to that, and as an important aspect of our identity. Let me skip that because I really want to talk and have enough time to talk about the last bit, and this is self-enhancement, protecting the self. Okay. So remember that I said that basically the idea is that the self has the special status, but it's also protected. It is protected from any threats which hinder us to see who we truly are, but help us to make us feel good about ourselves. So when we think about the self, we think about it as kind of like we have certain motivations, desires attached to themselves. One of them is self-assessment. We want to know who we are. I'll talk about this in a second. The other one is self-verification. This is a theory that's especially influential in clinical psychology, where people think like we want to verify who we think we are. So if I think I'm a good person, then I want to verify that I'm a good person. I seek out this information and processes primarily that confirms that. But if I think I'm a bad person, for instance, I'm a depressed person, then I will also seek out information that is that confirms my negative view about myself. And this is something that helps to understand a lot within clinical psychology. But the thing that most social psychologists subscribe to is the idea of self-enhancement, that we have this really strong desire and motive that to feel good about ourselves. Okay, I come back to this in a little bit with a concrete explanation and some of the mechanisms that help us protect our positive self-view. Just to kind of say, it's like one of the things when we talk about self-assessment and who we want to, there's a real interesting thing. It's like if you kind of go on BuzzFeed, right, you see here, these are the three, I think this is number 8, 9, 10 most popular quizzes this month or last month. We just had the beginning of a new month on BuzzFeed. It's like eat your way through the day and find out which Euphoria girl personality embodies your soul. Tell me who your favorite actors are, and I'll reveal what your soulmate is doing right now. Everyone has an Encanto character that matches their personality. Who's yours? And the idea is that we really want to know who we are. And there's a really interesting video on YouTube. There are also some articles on this on the internet. I have it in the links here, where the person who, Jonah Peretti, he's the founder of BuzzFeed. And he kind of realized that because our traditional values about religion, nationality, and life experience all crumble, we have this real longing to try to find, even just momentarily, a little sense of identity. And so he wrote about this, I think, in his master thesis, and then started to fund BuzzFeed, which is basically all around this. You go there and you mix the products with your identity in order to kind of have a moment of self-identity. But it shows you the power of trying to figure out who we are. This is one of the motives. But the motive we want to talk most about is self-enhancement. And self-enhancement is like a motivation that we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to maintain our positive self-esteem. And we want to kind of, and this gets activated, this motivation, especially if we are threatened, okay? And so any type of threat activates our motivation to feel good about ourselves and thereby some kind of defensive mechanisms. That's the key essence of self-enhancement, okay? So here's this kind of study, Joshua Knope, Paul Bloom, and others looked at this, where they kind of asked themselves, okay, who do we think the true self of Marc Piermont is? Who do you think, is it like, if you remember in the beginning, he was this person who was fighting, he was trying not to be gay, but had these gay impulses. He said, I'm not gay, but he had sex with men. So what is he? Is his true self, is he gay or is he not gay? Okay. And it turns out, it basically tells us whether you think his true self is gay or his true self is not gay, depends on what do you think, whether it's something good or bad to be gay. If you think it's good to be gay, then you think his true self is to be gay. And if you think being gay is something bad, then you think his good self, or his true self, is not being gay. So what that tells us, these studies, and in this study, Joshua Knope and others look at many different instances, it tells us that we want to believe that at the core of other people and ourselves, at the ideal self, the true self, the thing that we are, that's most important to us, there's something good, right? You can think a little bit about, if you're watching Star Wars, you can apply this also to Darth Vader and our wish to hope that at the end he's actually a good person. So we in ourselves have this kind of preference for positive over negative self-views. What we want to believe is that our true selves are really good selves. And if we think that something is good, then we think we're more likely that this is more likely part of our true self. So now we have this kind of like preference we want to believe. And now here's the idea of the psychological immune system. So you can think about like an immune system as a threat comes in, like some kind of germs or bacteria, and then the immune system kicks in and fights them off. And the same thing is, we think as psychologists, we have is this kind of like, we have a psychological immune system that any threat to our self-esteem is dealt with by certain self-defensive, self-protective mechanisms, okay? So this psychological immune system is the artful method by which the human mind ignores augments, transforms, and rearranges more information in its unending battle against the effective consequences of negative events. Okay? Something bad happens, I might have to question myself and my future or my abilities, or maybe my psychological immune system kicks in and shapes it into something that makes me still feel good about myself. Okay, and these are kind of like, this is like the symbols here in our slides for these psychological defense mechanisms. So one of them is, and this is like I mentioned before, it's like what people do is they put themselves strategically in positions where they are less likely to be threatened. Okay, so if I have negative feedback, I probably should come. You should come to me and talk about this, because this will help you to do better next time. But this is a situation where you likely feel threatened about yourself, so you don't come. But if I did very well, then yes, let me talk to Andreas and see let's see all the nice things that he has to say about my coursework and about me. So people sign up for feedback, right? We strategically select situations to kind of get positive and not negative feedback. We also use, and this is just a quick reminder in our lives, we often, when we are threatened, we use downward comparisons in order to make us feel better about good about ourselves. So downward comparison, in the moment a threat comes, we use the downward comparison. Oh, there was somebody who dealt or like who didn't even, they failed. Oh, I could have been this. Oh, I'm clearly better than them. Some people are not even going to university, so I'm fine. Downward comparisons are often a strategic way to deal with threat too. Here are some of the defensive mechanisms we will talk about when we in the upcoming weeks. You can see basically every week we have some type of defensive mechanism, right? You can just think about basically why are people racist? Why do they have this desire to put others down, right? Why do they have to say, oh, I'm British, British is better than X? It is as a way of protecting their self and enhancing their self. So we have to understand these processes in order to understand how people explain on what others do, how they perceive others, and how they interact with others. Here's one study to kind of look a little bit in how this works in real life, okay? So there's one thing where you can avoid negative feedback, but sometimes you can't, right? So what does the kind of psychological immune system in action look like in order to protect our self-esteem when we actually get negative feedback, okay? So this is a study by Sidikis and colleagues, sorry, where you had to do a personality test, okay? It was kind of a bogus personality test, and then you got feedback. You got neutral feedback, positive feedback, and negative feedback. Negative feedback would be something, oh, your scores indicate that you have a tendency to lie. And the positive is, oh, positive, you seem to be a person that other people like, and so forth. Okay, and then they would say, oh, okay, here are some examples. And then at the end, they would have a surprise recall. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, I think 30 minutes later, they have a recall. What do you remember of the feedback you just got? And what you can see here, this is the experiments, and you see central behaviors and peripheral behaviors. Let's just focus on the central behaviors on the left for a moment. You have positive and negative. What you can see for the self is that what people remember more is the positive and less the negative, okay? This difference is not significant when we talk about less important peripheral behaviors, right? But it's like if you, here for instance, if you look down at the second study and you see the difference between the self, and for positive and negative, you see a much higher percentage, 42% remembered, than the 30% remembered for the positive, than the lower numbers remembered for the negative. And you don't see this for peripheral. So if there's a threat, if I receive negative feedback about something that's really important to myself, then I tend to neglect that. I forget what happened. Oh, sorry, okay. You can buffer this by inflate the ego beforehand by telling them, oh, you're an amazing person, so your self is enhanced, you have an ego inflation, and then people can handle negative feedback much better. So this is because then if they feel secure in themselves, their defensive mechanisms do not jump into action because the feedback is less threatening. Okay, let's just get kind of jump through this. This is like the same message. This is a different where it's like remembering bad things that you did. We will come back to this when we talk about moral behavior in the last lecture. Okay. And now this is my last point. Sorry for like we're 56 minutes in, but this is my last point, and this is about self-enhancement and awareness. Okay. And I said to you guys right beforehand, there's like the tricky thing is with these processes is that they help us to feel good about ourselves, right? But somehow we have this immune system that makes us forget certain things, that steers us away from certain situations, that processes information, as you will see in the video for the additional videos uploaded tomorrow. What you will see is that we have a way of kind of forgetting things that are true, but we don't want to know about ourselves. And this makes us feel good about ourselves. And it also, but also hinders self-insight. Okay. And the other thing is, which is really important. So we as social psychologists do not believe that people have a very good insight into themselves. So asking people why they do things is a really bad idea. There's hundreds and hundreds of studies showing again and again that people do not know why they do things. They don't understand the processes or the reasons behind it. You can ask them whether they like one thing or the other, but they don't know whether this is why or not, right? You can ask them, why do you think you're a good person? They will tell you something, but these are not the real reasons that this like their evaluation came about. Okay. So there's like two components. There's a lack of insight, and the other component is that there seems to be something working automatically, almost outside of our mental awareness. Unconscious we don't like, but we like to call it automatic. And you can see again, this is, I will talk about this in the second video on Moodle when we talk about depression and these mechanisms, that there's almost something automatic that prevents us from really understanding ourselves. And that leads often, which like, I'll skip the Dunning-Kruger effect, which about kind of like a demonstration of how little we know about ourselves, and kind of ended on here. There's Timothy Wilson, one of the most eminent social psychologists of the last century, has this fantastic book, strongly recommended short book about strangers ourselves, where he kind of accumulates all the knowledge that we have about showing that people have, you and I, we have a really poor understanding of who we are. We think because we have all access to our thoughts, we really understand ourselves and why we do the things and whom would be a good partner and so forth. And often, as he demonstrates in his book, summarizing many, many studies, other people in our vicinity have a much better understanding of what our motivations are than ourselves. And so he says we're strangers to ourselves. And so this is kind of the cost, the negative side of the self-enhancement. We feel good about ourselves, but we're a little bit ignorant about who we really are. Okay, I would like to stop this here. I think I'm almost over time. And I would invite everyone who has a question to simply stay on this like in the stream here, and then we can chat about this, and then we will see each other yes, kind of virtually next week. All right.